They run it back before the track is done. Rap is done. Most songs lack.
Hello, Anime Speedruns Festival, SpeedGaming, and the Japanese Restream. I have a very special guest for you right now. This is Adam Wescott, and he's going to be talking about Astro Boy, the Omega Factor, and a lot of things related to that. I'm going to go ahead and let him introduce himself, and I'm going to be here vicariously through you. While you're watching, what I would say is if you have questions, if you have comments you want to make, put them in the chat. We're watching, and I'll make sure to ask some of the good questions toward the end when there's an opportunity. Maybe I'll take one of them. Let's go ahead and get started. Take it away.
Great, sounds good. I'll try to make sure that we leave at least some time for questions at the end. This PowerPoint runs a little long, so hopefully I have a timer going here just to make sure we don't go way overboard. Okay, so here we go. Astro Boy Omega Factor. Who am I? My name's Adam Wescott. I'm a Wendigo over on Blue Sky. I have like a little rodent Andes Chucky AVI as well from the show Shirobako, which is super good. Written stuff for Crunchyroll News, Yadatachi, Comics Beat, Start Menu, and some other sites. I have a newsletter called Anywire. I ran a blog and co-host called RPG Maker Dungeon for a while, where I write about RPG Maker games. Do a podcast with a friend called Unpacking the Shelf, where we talk about games and comics and stuff. I like Dragon Quest, a bunch of other things, but we're not here to talk about me. We are here to talk about Astro Boy Omega Factor, the Game Boy Advance game that came out in 2003 or so. So what is Astro Boy Omega Factor? It is an action game for Game Boy Advance. It came out December 18th, 2003. It's a collaboration between Hitmaker and Treasure, and it honors the 40th anniversary of the original Astro Boy animated series. Now, just like this game is called Astro Boy Omega Factor, there were many different factors that kind of came together to make this thing what it was, which is a pretty unique game and maybe one of the more unique games on the Game Boy Advance. So as we walk down what these different things are, and which will take a little bit, but considering the kind of game this is, I think it does help us if we kind of take piece by piece, like work down what are all the different pieces here. So first off, who is Astro Boy? So Astro Boy is a robot with the heart of a human boy. You may say, when I say who is Astro Boy, you'll say, what do you mean? Like, it's Adam, not Astro Boy, and that's true. He appeared first in a comic called Tetsuo no Adam that I believe started running in 1953. I'm going to call him Astro rather than Adam in this case, just because this is a game we're talking about called Astro Boy Omega Factor, and if I call him Adam the entire time, it might get it might not be great, so we're sticking at Astro for now. The Astro Boy origin has been retold in reversion a couple different times, but most consistently, it's that Astro Boy is a robot who was made by the extremely smart Dr. Tenma after Dr. Tenma's son Tobio passed away. But Tenma couldn't be satisfied with Astro, so he was sold to the Robot Circus, but he was adopted by the friendly Dr. Onoshimizu. Now, Astro is very powerful. He can shoot lasers out of his arm. He can shoot machine gun fire out of his butt, which is true somehow. He can fly, but his greatest strength of all is not his physical power, but is in fact his empathy. Now, there's a great storyline in Astro Boy called the greatest robot in the world about a big horn guy named Pluto. Pluto's whole thing is he goes around finding all the greatest robots in the world, and he says, I am stronger than you, and he beats them up. So, of course, Astro can see in the right here. He has this big showdown with Pluto, and he beats him up. But, if this was a Shonen Jump comic or something more recent, that would be where the story starts. That would be where it would stop, Astro beats up the bad guy, that'd be it. But even back in his time, in the 1950s, 1960s, Tezuka had greater ambitions than that. And so the story ends with Astro and Dr. Onoshimizu looking up at the faces of all these robots who passed away over the course of the story, saying, Professor, I still believe robots will all become friends someday and never ever fight each other again. From the very beginning, the idea of violence and non-violence and peace was kind of fundamental to this story. I think there are people today who, when pointing at anime or video games or whatever, they'll say, this stuff isn't political, or it's not political in the way that you think. But I think if you talk like that, you're really selling folks like Tezuka short. Osamu Tezuka was someone who had all kinds of ideas about the world he was in. He was drawing constantly, and he was putting all those ideas in his works all the time. Now, some of those ideas don't line up with our ideas. Some of those ideas are really strange, but he really wanted to fit as much as he could of everything around him into the kinds of stories he made. You could say, in fact, So this is Osamu Tezuka right here, sitting on a giant pile of Astro Boy comics and various other things. He's the guy who created Astro Boy and made it what it is. Was born in 1928, died in 1989. He was originally a doctor before he decided to draw. He effectively, so he's known pretty often as what's called like the god of manga, because people say kind of created like the medium as we know it. Is that true? He was very influential. There are a lot of like other folks who also did a lot of great stuff, but certainly like he made lots and lots of comics and really like pushed things forwards in terms of what could be done. Like you can see a quote from Ryan Holmberg here saying he synthesized existing Japanese American comics in what would become the basic shape of Japanese story manga in the post-war period. Like when we talk about what manga looks like today, stuff like Dragon Ball, Naruto, or even things like Skip Beat or like F or something more indie, a lot of that stuff is all operating in a tradition that Tezuka and his folks helped make. Now, in terms of Tezuka's early stuff, the comic that put him on the scene really was New Treasure Island or Shin Takarajima back in 1947. This was one of the very earliest examples of what was called a story comic that was influenced by cinema in a way. Another masterpiece of his, he did Metropolis in 1949, which was adapted into a pretty great film many years later. And then what we call in the US Kimba the White Lion, but in Japanese is Jungle Taitei or Jungle Emperor. I should say these 3 series were all a pretty big deal, and these were all before Astro Boy. So it's not necessarily the case that Astro Boy was his breakthrough success, although it was really huge. It was that he was already kind of laying the groundwork for all this. He had these hits to his name. It was just Astro Boy that sort of took him to the next level, as it were. Now, I mentioned earlier that Osamu Tezuka could draw all kinds of comics. And yeah, like the really amazing thing about him was he drew comics in just about every single genre you could think of. Like it'd be one thing if he was really good at drawing superhero comics, one thing if he was great at drawing medical comics or supernatural comics or romance comics, but he basically did everything. So for instance, you have Blackjack from 1973, really cool comic, a medical series about this cool doctor who wanders around solving impossible procedures. There's a famous scene from Blackjack I love where he operates on his own intestines while in an Australian outback surrounded by rabid dingoes. That's a scene from that comic. It's bonkers. Phoenix is one of his greatest works. It's 12 volumes long, never completed. Cosmic sci-fi history, just everything is in there. The world is like destroyed and reborn in the second storyline, which is just really out there. Doro 1967 is a historical horror comic of lots of blood and gore. He could really just do all of this stuff, and that's not even everything he could do. Like he did a historical comic called Message to Adolf about World War II. He did a bunch of like horny sex comics, one Barbara and several others. So he was just, his range is pretty incredible. Now, another unique thing about Tezuka is as time has gone on, people have adapted a number of his works into original stories on their own. One of the more successful ones is Naoki Urasawa's Pluto, which came out some years ago, was adapted into an anime series that's screened on Netflix last year, like the year before that, I believe. Definitely a really interesting take, kind of reinterpreting like the cartoonish elements as Astro Boy as this neo-noir with Urasawa's signature kind of realist edge to the art. And then you have a couple different cool adaptations of Doro, which I mentioned earlier. You have Search and Destroy, which was just recently translated in English by Atsushi Kaneko, one of the greatest, coolest comics artists currently working, shamefully under-translated in the US. On the right here, you'll also see there was a recent MAPPA anime adaptation of Doro as well, which had the director of Spy Family and the 1999 Hunter x Hunter attached. So lots of really talented people have had the chance to take a crack at Tezuka's work. Which brings us to anime, as a matter of fact. So Astro Boy, aside from being an extremely popular character and an extremely popular comic, was one of the most important, influential anime productions ever. So the most important by far was probably the 1963 version, which kind of set the standard for anime, serial anime as a whole, you could say. Now, that's not to say that Astro Boy was like the first piece of Japanese animation, because it was not. If folks want to learn more about this, I recommend reading Jonathan Clement's book, Anime History, which gets into this. Astro Boy doesn't come up in that book until the halfway point, which I guess you could say is maybe a bit on Jonathan Clement's part. He's sort of messing with the reader a bit. But, I mean, certainly there was stuff before it, but the idea of having a weekly series that like took shortcuts in order to meet like the standards of getting it up on television every week. This was something that people hadn't really done before in Japan, or really in many places, and Tezuka's folks were able to pull it off somehow. I should also say a lot of really talented old anime folks worked on this show. Like if you're watching Mobile Suit Gundam G-Quacks right now, like, you know, Yoshiyuki Tamano did the earlier Gundam stuff. Tomino also played a role on Astro Boy. Yeah, people like Osamu Dezaki, one of the all-time kind of auteurist anime directors, he was on this show. Gizaburi Sugi was there. Rintaro, who actually did the great Metropolis film, was there. Just all of these people who would go on to make the anime industry what it was for several decades later, all played a role in making this thing happen. Now, some years later, there was a 1980 version, and that was in color, which was pretty cool. I don't know nearly as much about that one, except I believe it should be pretty easily available to find and check out. Both 1963 and 1980 were dubbed, from what I understand, and should be fairly accessible, or at least they were accessible on DVD and that sort of thing some time ago. What I will say about 1980, I read a piece by Mike Toole, who's a great anime writer. He talked about the version of the story The Greatest Robot in the World in the 1980 version, which runs for about 2 episodes, being especially good. So if you'd like a nice taster to Astro Boy, might not be a bad idea seeking out the 1980 version, like looking for some of those storylines that adapt some of the stuff in the comic and looking through those. Now, there was one last significant Astro Boy animated series, and that's Astro Boy 2003. Now, this was a 40th anniversary celebration of the original anime. They brought on an all-star team of creators, particularly scriptwriters. The really funny thing is a lot of these writers actually wrote for the Ultraman revival back in the 1990s and going through 2000s, like starting of Ultraman Tiga and going ahead. So some names people might recognize, you have stuff like Chiaki Kanaka, who did shows like Serial Experiments Lane and Digimon Tamers, one of my personal favorites. He wrote a couple episodes of the series. You have Keiichi Hasegawa, who, if you are a fan of SSS Gridman or Dynazenon, he worked on those. Also did like one of the great kind of noble failures, which I love, of Tokusatsu history, Ultraman Nexus. Sadayuki Murai as well, who did the script to Boogie Pop Phantom, to a couple of Satoshi Kon films, I believe, and to Natsume's Book of Friends as well, so you're into that. All these different people worked on that show. You also have Mark Handler, who was the guy who did he was the ADR director, and he did the script for the dub version of Fooly Cooly, like one of the great dubs of the 2000s. And he was actually, from what I understand, the script editor on Astro Boy 2003. Like, he was working with all the Japanese writers trying to clodge things together. He wrote a script for the show as well. Now, actually, a lot of people on the team apparently did not like Mark Handler because he was sort of in a bad spot. Like, he was in charge of looking at all the scripts and making sure that they were a good fit for American television. They wouldn't set off any censors. And unfortunately, like, the Ultraman folks were really just used to just doing really cool creative stuff because that's what survived productions the Ultraman folks let them get away with. And unfortunately, that was not the way it worked on television in the US. So famously, the dub for Astro Boy, it doesn't necessarily butcher it totally, but they changed up the soundtrack. They cut out some of the more difficult parts from the show. It's changed enough that I don't know if you can really call it a faithful version of what the Japanese staff were aiming for. And to be fair, they were aiming at something that would reach audiences all over the world. But we currently live in a world now where, like, for whatever reason, you still can't really get the original, like, intended Japanese version of Astro Boy 2003. It's unfortunately not available, unless if you go looking for fan subs and stuff, like, some of that stuff is floating around. But I'm hoping that one day, like, maybe Sony will relent and Discotek or something will get their hands on a proper English version of this. So the reason I bring up Astro Boy 2003 is because this series, as it's coming out to hit the 40th anniversary celebration of the original anime, it then spawns a couple of video games that all borrow pretty heavily from the visual aesthetic of this show rather than from the earlier ones. So you have 2 major titles I'm aware of. You have Astro Boy for the PlayStation 2. This was developed by Sonic Team, weirdly enough, and I believe it came out in 2004, like a little after the anime started airing, and after a Mega Factor, actually. I don't know much about this game. My understanding is it's like not necessarily as special as a Mega Factor, but if there are folks out there who are big fans of Astro Boy for the PS2, feel free to shout it out. That's cool. But we're here to talk about a Mega Factor, and a Mega Factor for the GBA is the game I think that's really remembered of these two. And that's right, our boy is finally here. We're actually talking about the game now. After a couple minutes of prologue, we can finally get to the actual game itself. So who made Astro Boy a Mega Factor? Somehow I always thought, oh, this is a Treasure game, and definitely Treasure played a huge role in making this thing. But while doing research for this, as a matter of fact, it was Hitmaker as well who was responsible. So Hitmaker, it's a Hitmaker production with Treasure as well. So Hitmaker, for folks who know, it was an inner studio at Sega. They were formerly called AM3. They were especially in charge of arcade games. They produced stuff like Virtual Tennis and Crazy Taxi, but around the early 2000s, they started shifting more into making games for the Dreamcast, making games for consoles rather than arcades, and so their name was changed to Hitmaker. They put out a bunch of pretty cool stuff, actually. There was a producer there named Mie Kumagai, and from what I understand from a Play magazine issue 31 that I read, she was the one who actually came up with the idea for doing this. She said Osamu Tezuka is the god of animation circles. You've always wanted to do a game according to his stories. And so she was kind of casting around and saying, okay, who should I pick to put this thing together? So her hand lands on Tetsuo Okano, the director, who at this time hadn't necessarily done a lot of stuff. Probably the game he'd made that he was most famous for, from what I understand, was an RPG called Segaga, which was very strangely just a role-playing game set in the Sega studios, starring Sega characters, folks who make Sega games, that kind of thing. One of these really inside baseball titles that developed a cult audience. I believe there are folks who are trying to fan translate. I'm not sure if that's went anywhere. But so Okano, he's a big fan of Treasure. He says, I was such a big fan, I just decided to actually bring them in to help out with the game. So Tetsuo Okano and the producer, they teamed up. They went to Treasure, said, hey, do you want to help us make this game? And so Treasure signed up with them to make this title. Now we got to talk about what is Treasure. Now, if you're if you're a video game fan of a certain vintage, you're going to say, what do you mean, who's Treasure? Treasure is just one of the greatest 2D action developers ever made. But let's say either you lived under a rock or you're not a Gen Xer or a millennial and you don't know who Treasure is. Treasure is a studio that was founded by ex-Konami developers. They specialized in fast-paced creative action games. Their games didn't always sell, but a lot of your favorite developers are inspired by them. If you look at a lot of modern indie games that just maybe they'll have one idea that they develop in all kinds of directions, or they'll just have multiple stages that just go really wild in terms of having cool stuff going on. Or even something one game I think of, there's an indie game called Copy Kitty, which pretty much lifts its weapon system from a bunch of different Treasure games in terms of how you're supposed to use it. You definitely have folks out there who played Treasure when they were kids and are now making these same kinds of extremely creative out there games. If DBK is out there, I don't know if you're a Treasure fan or whatever, but do you want to briefly talk about it?
Which Treasure game should I gush about?
Well, that's a good question. I was actually going to jump to Gunstar Heroes. Is that something you can talk about?
Gunstar Heroes is sure. You can talk about Gunstar Heroes. Fantastic game. When we were talking before, we got on the topic of Bleach DS, another game that's really run in the community a lot. DS second, DS third. They've actually made one of the best Wario games, in my opinion. It's done by Treasure. World? Yeah, I think so.
Interesting.
And then they actually get a lot of anime license. So I'm gonna look it up to make sure I don't say the name wrong.
But actually, I'll jump a couple of slides ahead. I highlighted some of the anime titles here. Right.
Oh, you did? Okay, well, I could talk on most of them because, just, like you said, the quality of Treasure's games are way above usually the counterparts, but they don't tend to necessarily sell well. A lot of them are, I don't really know what causes that, but they're considered, it's very correct name, I think, because a lot of them are considered hidden treasures among the community. A lot of people, these games get into marathons. They're kind of beloved by not only runners, but other game developers and other creators, like you said. I don't know which one you want me to particularly touch on.
We can talk about the Bleach one. I have a soft spot for that. These came out after Astro Boy and Mega Factor, but I remember getting the first Bleach Fighter for Christmas and having a lot of fun with that, just because it felt like it sort of like captured the appeal of the different characters in that game, which you can't always rely on. Like that's one of the great things about licensed properties, I guess you can sort of think. How do you interpret like someone like Kenpachi, for instance? So it felt like they did a good job of like capturing the feeling of like those really out there Shinigami and cool guys in the earlier games. Though I've heard the second one's actually even better, though I haven't had a chance to play it.
Yeah, they're as far as fighting games though, they're considered the best on the DS, and the first one's considered, has one of the best story modes. Just in general, their attention to detail and their focus on the game system is what separates them from other developers. They tend to put a lot of focus on that, so they're highly technical. There's a lot of pretty much always some sort of canceling or combo that you can do in the game. Omega Factor is no different in that regard. It's probably got one of the most complicated cancel and like combo systems for on as a beat 'em up for the DS.
Yeah, or for the Game Boy Advance, because it was
for the DS. Sorry, Game Boy Advance. And then so the game I was thinking of is recently I was playing Dragon Drive, which is another series we haven't had at the marathon, but that game is extremely well done. The attention to detail is second to none, and I don't normally like rail shooters, but it felt so different from what was normal that I've kind of fallen in love with the game. I mean, some of the other things, if you want to talk about really well known things, like Ikaruga is probably like one of their most well known. If you're going back to the arcade, right? They did Bangai O, which is like a shoot 'em up.
I'm gonna flip up here. I made sure to highlight Bangai O.
Oh, nice. Here. Okay, nice. Yeah. So
a mecha game where you can have a robot with a giant baseball bat. That's the kind of game.
Yeah. I mean, some of their games, even the ones that might have been misses, like Rakugaki Showtime, still did things that were kind of unique. I would say maybe Dynamite Heady is another one. Like Dynamite Heady is definitely like a very unique game, but it did things pretty unique for the time, like control wise. And I will just say this, like, Dynamite Heady makes for a great speedrun. That's probably why it's so popular. You already talked on Gunstar Heroes.
I'm briefly going to shout out, since you were talking about weird movement, Silhouette Mirage. I believe a game where your character's moves just completely change based on the direction you're facing, which is just such an out there idea. Like, definitely a lot of treasure titles are famous for just having like these really strange concepts in terms of how the character moves, how they interact with things, or even just having really out there levels. Like I shouted out Gunstar Heroes earlier, I just wanted to put in a picture from the board game level. Nice. There's a board game level in Gunstar Heroes for some reason, which is just, the game has all kinds of other stuff in it to recommend it. It moves really fast.
So the board game is actually how you proceed through the game.
Oh,
so
like in
it's
general?
actually like in general, that's how you move through the stages, which was really unique. So when you're playing that game, you're always kind of like, it adds this like RNG luck factor that makes it more exciting from moving place to place, because you don't know necessarily what order you're going to land on the stages.
I see. So, I was playing Gunstar Heroes. I wasn't old enough to have a Genesis, so this was like on the Wii when it came out on Virtual Console. And I don't remember, now that I think about it, maybe they kind of mix things up. I don't remember getting to the board game level. Like definitely there's tons of to the board game. I don't remember like specifically the board game stuff. I just remember like seeing it online. Like definitely.
It's really, really unique, even the way you move through stages. And they did that again in not the board game aspect, but just like the way you move throughout the game and the controls is I have to name drop Guardian Heroes if you're going to talk about one more game.
For the Sega Saturn, right?
Oh yeah. One of the best beat 'em ups in general. I mean, just a quality list. I haven't played some of like the later titles that they released with Capcom. My favorites always kind of lay with Bleach. I'm definitely big in the community for that. And then you had Hajime no Ippo, the fighting there, which is, by the way, probably one of my favorite sports titles. They did it, in my opinion, much better than the PlayStation 2 and Wii counterparts.
Really?
Just for in general, like, the controls for that game are much tighter. Overall, just they captured the feel of the anime a little bit better. And it's probably if you're a big fan of Hajime no Ippo, definitely one of the better titles. As far as anime game goes, I think that's the majority of it. I don't think I mean, you had Yu Yu Hakusho, Makyo Toitsutsen, but
right. I'd also like to briefly shout out, since I made sure to include Gunstar Heroes there, one of the lead people who worked on Gunstar Heroes, the main programmer, was Mitsuru Yaida, or Yaiman as he's called. And he made an appearance on Astro Boy and Mega Factor itself as someone working on that team later, along with the composer Norio Hanzawa, or like NON as he's sometimes called. They both worked on that later game. Now, Hanzawa wasn't like the only composer on a Mega Factor, but he was definitely there. So it's certainly deliberate, I think, that Hitmaker, like when they were working on Treasure, they made sure like a lot of the folks who made games like Gunstar Heroes that kind of were there and like making this new Mega Factor game, which is pretty cool. There's that creative lineage they are leading from these earlier games to these later ones. All right, so I think we're gonna keep moving here. So after all of that, what is Astro Boy Mega Factor? What can we say about it? Well, it's an action game, of course. Treasure made action games. You're Astro Boy, a little robot. You can fly around, punch things, kick things, shoot lasers out of your arm, shoot machine guns out of your butt, rocket around. See this, there's a score in the corner, like beating things up increases your super level. There's a, how do I put it? A couple of like on-rail like shooter levels where you fly around and blow things up. So there's a little bit of that genre switching that you sometimes see in Treasure games. I would say that like the game's a little more restrained than some of Treasure's other stuff because it is in the Game Boy Advance. But you can really tell, like from the size of the sprites on the screen, the number of enemies they're able to fit on the screen, they're pushing the engine pretty far, I think. Like sometimes there's even some slowdown. From what I understand, they did improve the US version from the original Japanese version. Like they buffed it up a bit, had some difficulty levels, that kind of thing. So the version we got's like a bit more polished, but like still you get the sense that they're doing what they do in all their games, which is that they're sort of really pushing the boundaries of what you can get away with this system. So it's an action game, it's a beat 'em up, but it's also a role-playing game. Now, not necessarily in the conventional sense, like there aren't turn-based battles, you can't have people in your party. It's still a beat 'em up at the end of the day. But there is a system where there are lots of little characters who are hiding all over the game, and when you find them and talk to them, you can level up different abilities. Like, for instance, you can increase your life, you can increase your laser ability. There's an ability called Sensor, which is kind of annoying. Basically what it means is that it brightens up these various dark levels that you find, so it's sort of like pay a toll to not be inconvenienced, which maybe sucks a little bit, but I mean, I guess it's a thought that counts, perhaps. And story actually plays a surprisingly big role in this game, I believe. Like the way it works is you play through it once, you go through about 7 stages or so, but then once you reach the end, you actually loop back to the start and it opens up a stage select where you can kind of revisit places you found, fight new enemies and bosses, learn secrets about what's really happening. You have to kind of piece things together from all over the game in order to achieve the true ending, which is pretty interesting. And again, more of like a story kind of game than you'd expect from a Treasure game. Like Treasure games usually don't, I mean, sometimes do that kind of thing, but I think the sort of story that you see in this game is maybe even more Tetsuo Kano, like the director, like his specialty, rather than Treasure was really good at. So I think that does give Astro Boy Mega Factor kind of a unique flavor among a lot of Treasure's other stuff. Now, aside from these things, it's also a Tezuka game. So you might notice we brought up Blackjack earlier in this presentation. Blackjack actually appears in Astro Boy Mega Factor. He plays a pretty important role in the story. You just meet him, he's there, you talk to him, he helps things resolve. So Blackjack is there. Kimba the White Lion is also there. Now, this is a little tricky because Kimba the White Lion himself is not in the game, but there is another character who takes Kimba's form and kind of shifts between him and a couple others in a boss battle and plays an important role in the story. So once again, like people who made this game, they're reaching out to all these different famous Tezuka works to bring them all in. Now, who is this guy? So this character here is Sharaku, who's the villain of the game. He's from a Tezuka comic called The Three-Eyed One. And I think this kind of thing, for me, is also what helps Astro Boy and Mega Factor stand out from a lot of other stuff. It's not just that it takes characters from popular Tezuka comics or Tezuka comics we know of. It takes characters from like all over Tezuka's over, including characters who don't really show up that much in English, like the Wonder 3 and that kind of thing. You kind of play through this game, just see characters pop up and go, oh my gosh, I can't believe, who is this person? I want to find out. In the same way that back in the day, like for Super Smash Bros., I think a lot of people were inspired by characters like Ness or the characters from Fire Emblem, like Roy, for instance. Like, go back and check out those games. This Omega Factor has some of that appeal as well. However, I should say, it does get a little confusing because the way it uses those characters isn't necessarily consistent. Like, you'll have some characters that are characterized according to 2003 anime production, but you have others who are characterized more like they're from the manga source material. And then you have some that don't really act anything like the way they're depicted in the original. I guess the way you can think of it is like, there's this great anime OVA from back in the day called Giant Robo, The Day the Earth Stood Still, where similarly the director of that show took characters from all over Mitsuru Yokoyama's body of work and included them all in like a giant hodgepodge, kind of a giant cool epic story where everyone's like playing a role in the story, but they aren't necessarily faithful to the original depictions. I would say the same is actually probably true of this game. It's all a bit messy. And that might frustrate some Tezuka devotees who are like, hey, wait a minute, like this person isn't what I remember them, like they don't behave in the way I expect them to. However, this is also part of Tezuka's plan. Don't forget, Osamu Tezuka could do it all. So he had a particular system he liked to use called the Tezuka Star System, which was he would take character designs and actually reuse them throughout his work. So Blackjack would sometimes just show up as a doctor. Dr. Ochinomizu would appear if he wanted like a nice scientist guy. There's a special detective that he'd often reuse. And so it's not necessarily that all these stories take place in the same universe, but like Hollywood actors, he'd take his various characters and he'd repurpose them for all kinds of roles. So you could say that Astro Boy Omega Factor is very faithful to how Tezuka used his famous star system. It takes these various characters and it repurposes them for the roles that the game needs. And that's not necessarily to say that it's always completely faithful to the source material, but it at least like is made with love and respect for that material, I believe, which I think is pretty cool. Now, Tezuka himself also did a couple of big crossover works, one of which was called Undersea Supertrain Marine Express. It was a TV film from 1979, produced for Nippon Television's Iowa Chikyu Osuku charity program, something like Love Conquers the Earth or something like that. The reason I bring it up is that a lot of the characters I mentioned here all appear in this TV film. There's Blackjack, Kimba, Sharaku, the underwater train itself appears, the Mu Empire, which appears in Astro Boy Mega Factor, plays a role in this film as well. I can't say for certain if this movie is like a direct inspiration, but I would bet the people who made this game were aware of it when they made Astro Boy Mega Factor and kind of worked in some references to it as well. So, I mean, probably you're not going to find many folks in the US who are familiar with this film, but if you are, Astro Boy Mega Factor is probably like the closest you'll find to a video game version of this thing, even though it's not advertised as such. Now, let's go a little bit beyond Astro Boy Mega Factor and talk about what happened to the people who made it afterwards. So, as a matter of fact, a lot of the people who made this game aren't really in the games industry anymore. For instance, Hitmaker itself was folded back into Sega in 2004 as AM3, and in 2009 it was just merged back into Sega itself, into other departments. I think a couple of people from there are still probably in the games industry, but Hitmaker itself like doesn't really exist in that way anymore. Treasure itself is still around, but it hasn't really put out a game in a while. It's sort of in hiatus mode. The last game they did was Geist Crusher God from 2014, which was an expansion of Geist Crusher for the 3DS. That apparently wasn't very successful, so they moved on. My understanding is the original president's still there. They're like licensing out Ikaruga and that kind of thing. But Treasure itself hasn't produced a game in a long time. If they ever decide to, it'll be a huge deal. People would be freaking out, but hasn't happened. Miyakumagai, she became just the president of Hitmaker full stop in 2003, which was a pretty big deal for a woman in the Japanese games industry at that time. she's now actually developing smartphone games as an executive producer at this company called COLOPL. She actually, I think, maybe did relatively well compared to some other folks here. Tetsuo Kano himself, he developed a game called Thunder Force 6. Grand return of the Thunder Force series, highly anticipated. Unfortunately, kind of a mess, blew up his career. He left Sega, now he runs something called Hyuga Incorporated. So he's a small developer now. Rumor is that he is kind of difficult to work with, and that may be why he's in that position at the moment. I wanted to shout out one other member of the team, who is Tomohiro Saito. He was a freelance designer and artist who was one of the many people working in this game. He also worked on Streets of Rage 2 back in the day, as well as several of the kind of CCG concept titles. So he lost his leg to cancer, and he died of cancer in 2006. Hyuga Studios Twitter put out a tweet some years ago, or actually more recently maybe, which was saying, this moon stage, like the moon stage from Astro Boy, was created by Tomohiro Saito's pixel art. Because of this work, he was delayed in getting to the hospital, lost one of his legs, and finally died. This game is filled with his soul. Now, you can say, wow, like it's so cool that he'll put everything in this game. Or you can say, why did someone have to lose their leg making a video game? That's ridiculous. Like, apparently what happened was he was just pushing himself extremely hard to finish it up and just didn't go to the hospital because he waited. Or you can say because they didn't give him time off, or he didn't tell anyone what was happening to them, maybe. He lost his leg and then died. Saito said in this games developer interview, or the obituary that Brandon Sheffield wrote some time again for the game developer, Saito said, legs aren't necessary in the illustration industry. But I just want to take a moment to shout out this fact that, I mean, it's still true. Game development is still very difficult. I don't know if people necessarily like lose their legs to production, but certainly conditions are still quite bad. And considering Astro Boy Mega Factor itself was kind of pitched as a return to the Helicon Days of Treasure, I think it's also worth pointing at how to some degree, maybe the work conditions around this game were also a callback to like some of the excesses of the past in terms of what people were expected to sacrifice to make stuff like this. I don't know if it was the game developer's bad management, if it was the fact that Saito was a freelancer rather than someone who was in-house. These things all could have contributed. But definitely something that I think marks the legacy of this game along with everything else. So what does that leave us with? Astro Boy Mega Factor, it's a very strange game. A lot of the people who worked on it are no longer in the industry before, or they've really been downsized in the industry. At the same time, it's kind of a miracle this thing was made. It's not perfect. There are parts of it that I think other Treasure titles do better, and even parts that you can kind of feel the limits of its system. It's sort of straining its limits of its system. But this is a game that a lot of people hold in their hearts regardless. Like just the fact that it's filled with so much love for Tezuka's work, that it is so ambitious in terms of telling this large story featuring not just characters from Astro Boy, but from all over Tezuka's output. I think there are people out there who still just have respect for this thing even today. And if you're in an anime license game, this is definitely one of the most interesting, I would say. And here are the sources. All right, it's question time.
All right, so I had a question. Do you think so? There's a difference between the Japanese release of this game and the international release of this game. Right. Do you think there's a reason for that? And were there any other things that were adjusted between the releases besides the like weird rebalancing of the difficulty?
That's a good question. I would say, I can't pull off the top of my head. Definitely the difficulty was a huge thing. My understanding was that in the original Japanese version, the easy difficulty was extremely difficult, and the hard version was much harder. The English version, I believe, added a couple extra steps in, and so there's a bit more gradation. Speaking personally, I'm actually quite bad at games like Astro Boy and Mega Factor, so certainly I'd be playing at one of the easier difficulties just because cranking it up harder, like definitely, for me, that fight against the artificial sun in the second level is just noticeably tough, and it kind of tightens up from there. But I think also, like, they use it as an opportunity to do a second pass, like go through, add in some things that were missing originally, you didn't have time to put in. I would say that from my understanding, the additions were really driven by the studio themselves This wasn't something like a working designs title where they just went in and changed up the difficulty for arbitrary reasons, or where they just like multiplied the currency or like inserted pop culture references, whatever, in the script. There wasn't any of that. It was more of a okay, this was like a couple things in the cutting room floor that should have been in there, so let's put them in.
I know that there was like some new enemies. Did we have a list of the references and I don't know if you went over some of them, like the boss fight where they turn into the White Lion, which is really cool. Were there any other like characters that come out that are just so obscure and on for a second that might be somewhat like hard to notice?
I mean, they're all over the place, and sometimes they're even kind of out of the way. Like the way that this game handles its cameos is sometimes you'll just punch a corner of the screen, and then a character will appear and say, "Surprise, it's me!" Like Unico, I think, is like hidden in Ancient Mu. You have to like rocket up to the top and find a little like urn that you smash, and then Unico's in there. Some characters, it's like they don't even really have a reason to be there. It's like, ho, you found me. But others are more integrated with the plot. Like, again, it's a bit tricky because the characters don't always behave or perform the way you'd expect, like considering their source material. Like the final boss, I guess, is like a character from the Astro Boy comic, but I think Astro Boy like outwits him in that comic, like sort of sends him flying off into space rather than fighting hand to hand. But you do fight him hand to hand in the game, which is kind of cool. One that stuck out to me, there's that big fight with Sharaku, where he's just constantly summoning all these cool creatures and stuff. That I thought was interesting. I should also say, in the very first stage, you fight this giant spider robot, which is a pretty straightforward villain in the game. But in the 2003 anime, it's not the case. Actually, the first episode of the anime, from what I believe, wraps up with Astro Boy and the spider coming to terms and sort of finding resolution. So that is actually one area where they made the game more video gamey, you can say, rather than keeping in more of the story bits.
There's a question about, I feel like someone asked, Shrimpson asked, I feel I remember a big picture Astro Boy in the mid 2000s. Does that fit in anywhere? 2010s.
Big picture. So there was an Astro Boy film that came out in 2009. I haven't seen it. It is a 3D film, so it's noticeably different from the earlier titles. And it's a film rather than a TV series as well, which is also a difference. It was made by a studio I think was called Imagi. It didn't do very well. I think the studio, I believe, like either kind of folded or something else happened to it. But I think 2003 was definitely not the last Astro Boy production, but I would say it was probably like the last successful one. There have been a couple new productions that have been teased over the past couple of years. There was one that, if anyone's familiar with the 3D CG animated series Miraculous Ladybug, one of the creative directors on that was apparently working on an Astro Boy series some time ago, but that I don't think has gone anywhere. We haven't heard anything about it since. So definitely like 2009 Astro Boy film is one I would say. I think there was a series of shorts as well that were aired in another country that there are some fans of, but those are the ones I'd be familiar with. Aside from the various reboots, of course. I mean, I should say that I don't remember the title, there was a manga series based on Astro Boy that got an anime adaptation a couple of years ago. This wasn't anything by Tezuka, this was again like another artist taking a crack at that same story. Like a sort of re-envisioning the start of Astro Boy and his origin. The character looks totally different. It had a really incredible opening by the same guy who did the opening to the anime series Carol and Tuesday. I would say that is probably the most notable thing about it.
I have one more question. If you could recommend a cameo series, like for example, I know Jetter or Mars is in the game, right. And I remember being excited for Ambassador Magma, which is one of my favorites.
Oh, absolutely, Ambassador Magma is there. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there any other like references that are like, okay, this is a deep cut, but you should watch the series because, I haven't touched on a lot of those series, so maybe there's one that you're like, okay, outside of Astro Boy, this is a good spin-off, or this is a good series that you should definitely watch to get the reference. But I never watched, for example, Jet or Mars or some of the others. This is
not at all a deep cut, but I would say that if you have not read Blackjack, you should definitely read Blackjack.
That's true.
It's for a lot of folks, they'll say, oh, this is like one of Tezuka's best series. It's really messy. It's all over the place. It's like super kind of trashy sometimes. But it's definitely, if you want a series that has everything Tezuka does in one package, it's pretty good at that. And a lot of the stories stand alone. So that's pretty cool. I think honestly, for a lot of folks, they might know who Astro Boy is. They might just not know who Blackjack is. So while Blackjack is definitely in no way obscure to the average Tezuka fan, I think for regular folks, Blackjack might not be something they'll be familiar with. I'll also say there's a very good animated TV version of Blackjack that Osamu Dezaki directed. It's sort of in Dezaki's style. It's like very melodramatic. There's beautiful visuals. There's the character designer. I believe it's Akio Sugino who works on the series as well. There have been a couple different Blackjack adaptations, but that is the one I recommend checking out. It used to be available on Retro Crush. If that's still around, if you're happen to be in an area where that's available, I recommend checking it out there if you don't have access to the manga.
Yeah, I will back that recommendation. So.
Yeah, I will also say, since you brought up recommendations, if you listen to this presentation and you want to learn more about Treasure in particular, there are two different things I recommend. There's a book called Legends of 16-Bit Game Development by John Harrison, which is apparently the single best source for information on Treasure in English. Unfortunately, I did some digging and it looks like it's out of print. So unless they reprint it, that probably won't be easily available. But I'd also say there's a website called Shmuplations, which is really famous for having translating lots of formerly Japanese-only interviews of different developers. They have a ton of information on Treasure in there. So I'd recommend going to that site and digging around if you want to learn more about past Treasure titles. I checked, I don't think they have anything about Astro Boy and Mega Factor, but they do have a bunch of info about early 90s Treasure titles and even some 2000s ones. So that's a good place to go to if you're looking for more info about that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, just I want to say out there that if you're watching this live and you missed some of it, this will be available on the Anime Speedruns YouTube. Feel free to reach out to Adam Wescott. He has a again, you want to drop where people can find you at?
Oh yeah, I'm on Blue Sky at wendego.bluesky.social. I have a newsletter, anniewire.ghost.io. I have a podcast of a friend, Unpacking the Shelf, where I talk about all kinds of things. And I write for a couple different sites. I think I have some pieces for Crunchyroll News going up relatively soon. I've been reviewing manga for Yadatachi. Did a piece on Start Menu about free indie games that came out a little while ago. So trying to get new stuff out there. Definitely this game is one that's I think is really interesting. So it was a lot of fun to have a chance to dig into it and talk about it. Especially Tezuka is also someone who's very meaningful to me. I read Phoenix when I was a kid and got to the Phoenix Space arc where the entire world ends and the main character becomes God and recreates the world. 12-year-old me was like, you can do that in a comic? You can. It was really mind-blowing. Yeah. Although I will also suggest, even if you're a big Tezuka fan, if you haven't read a lot of the other artists around Tezuka, folks like Ishinomori, who did Kamen Rider, or there's a really cool series called Legend of Kamui, which has just got an English translation slowly coming out, I think through Drawn and Quarterly last year. Definitely check some of that stuff out too. I think Tezuka's extremely kind of overrepresented in a way in English language scholarship. There are tons of other manga artists that he was directly competing with. And in fact, Tezuka produced a lot of his best work because he was super jealous of other artists in the field and was trying to outdo them. So definitely read up on Tezuka if you haven't. But then once you've read Tezuka, seek out other artists as well and dig into them. Just like with games, I think it's always fun to kind of go looking around and find out about stuff you don't know much about, whether it's anime games, video games, whichever. So all kinds of cool stuff out there if you go digging for it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Adam. And this has been a great discussion. I'd like to have you absolutely back again. When we were coming up with this discussion, there was so many good topics and so many
for sure.
name drops that happened. Even some of the games we talked about today could probably deserve, absolutely deserve.
Their own panel. Any treasure game, I could say, you could probably make a whole PowerPoint based on that. Talk forever.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about the other, like every single Astro Boy game, or there's a blackjack game for the 3DS. That in
fact, I think the director of Astro Boy and Mega Factor worked on a blackjack game.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, that's another one that sometime might deserve a deep dive. But yeah, like Adam said, if there's something here that inspired you, whether it's reading about Tezuka, whether it's about researching one of the games or anime series, there's a lot here to digest. And definitely join our Discord and let us know what you want Adam Wescott to talk about next, and I'm sure he'd be happy to come back. Yeah, or if there's other folks out there who you'd love to see talk about one topic or another, like any speedrunner for this community, like I'm sure there are folks out there who are experts in all kinds of things to go deep on anything. Shout outs to Dracodon-san. Yeah. All right, let's call it here, and we're gonna go ahead and prep for the next run by Cotton-san. That's Kid Station Anpanman 2 Anpanman to Daiboken. Adventure with Anpanman. All right. See you in just a bit.